the trust fund is being drawn down as the boomer age wave accelerates, and also due to a couple other factors. For a variety of reasons, that trust fund is headed down and is projected to be exhausted or depleted. Currently, the projection is 2033.
Welcome everyone to 45 Forward. I'm your host, Ron Roel. Now, there's a lot of upheaval these days across Washington as many federal agencies face significant cuts in staffing and programs, including the Social Security Administration. What's not exactly clear is what changes are going on inside these agencies. The news seems to change by the week, but what is clear is that many people are really anxious about the potential loss of their benefits and services, both near term and in the upcoming years. Will Social Security be there when they need it? So today we're talking with Mark Miller, a nationally recognized expert on retirement planning and aging, who will spell out the many critical issues facing Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid today, and what they might mean for us. Mark is an awarded journalist, author, and podcaster who offers a holistic view of retirement security. He writes frequently about retirement-related public policy issues, and his work appears in many venues, including Reuters, the New York Times, Morningstar, and wealthmanagement.com. He also has a Substack newsletter, podcast, and retirement, and he has a terrific book, Retirement Reboot, Common Sense Strategies for Getting Back on Track. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get on and meet our guest, Mark Miller. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ron. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you've been on a couple of times, and every time you have really great things to say and update our audience. So before we actually get into some of the topics, there's a lot, as I mentioned. Just tell me a little bit about yourself. People can read all about your biography. I'm interested because, like you, I'm a business journalist, and I sort of moved toward retirement issues. So what moved you to cover retirement and aging issues?
Well, as you mentioned, I came out of a background covering business and financial news for many years here in the Chicago area for newspapers and magazines, and actually started a magazine for the Tribune Company back around 2003, I think it was, around topics related to retirement. That only lasted a couple of years, but it sort of whet my appetite for more in the area. And that's when I went off and started a career as a freelancer covering the space, and been at it ever since. 17, 18 years now on this beat.
Wow. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot of evolution. I think people, well, certainly with the increasing longevity, people realize that it's an important issue. Lots of opportunities and challenges, but lots of things that people need to think about to plan ahead. So
yeah, I just felt like it was a really critically important area, and one that was going to be a lot of growth in terms of interest as the country got older. You look at these sort of, any life transitional topic is one where there's an information need, and this is certainly one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there has been a lot of media coverage of the Trump administration and DOJ's slash of employees and agencies, including Social Security. So but before we talk about, what's going on to the extent that we know, tell us, our audience, about why is this so important? What is it about Social Security especially, but all these sorts of social insurance programs?
Yeah, this has been on my mind lately. Social Security turns 90 in August this year. Right. It was passed into law August 14th, 1935. So I've been doing some research for an article on this topic. It is really Social Security, its passage kind of ushered in the era of modern era of retirement as we know it today. In other words, a time where one could be, independent from work, at an older age. It wasn't really a concept before that. There wasn't a financial means to do it. There was no such thing as a pension or certainly a 401k. None of that existed at the time. Right. It was born out of the Great Depression. And at the time that Social Security was passed into law and signed by FDR, 40% or more of seniors were living in poverty in the United States. So there was a hue and cry to do something about it. And a handful of states had started various sorts of old age pension programs, or in some cases unemployment insurance programs, which were sort of the precursors to social insurance. By this phrase, we mean programs where people pay in via tax into a collective risk pool and are able to draw a benefit based on participation. So Social Security has really ushered in the era of social insurance in the United States, followed later in the 1960s by the passage of Medicare. So, it's the one universal retirement program that we have. Almost all Americans participate in it. Participation is automatic. And the distribution of benefits is nearly universal. So, what I've found over the years is that covering a lot of different topics related to retirement, that, nothing gets interest from readers quite as much as Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah, and I think people are generally aware. They know it's important, but I don't think they're aware of just how important, and that in terms of keeping people out of poverty, importance especially to women who live longer and often whose benefits are interrupted by leaving and taking care of a family. So talk
And,
a little bit about, yeah.
it's the fact that it's a guaranteed income source. So if fewer workers are receiving defined benefit pensions these days than in the past, although they're still quite prevalent in the public sector, less so in the private sector. And people ask from time to time, well, how much do I need to save for retirement? It's a difficult question to answer unless you know how long you'll live. But if you have pension style benefit, such as provided by Social Security, which is also inflation adjusted, this is a very different thing. It's going to be there as long as you live. So this is a really critical component of it. And for people who are sort of middle income and lower income, Social Security is usually the majority of their retirement income. Plus, it provides insurance in the event of a disability, survivor insurance paid to widows and children. So, it's a form of insurance, really. That is absolutely critical and so valuable.
Yeah, I think that your point about the universality of it too is important, and that everyone participates. It's not sort of a handout. People participate; they contribute to it. It's people talk about, well, you earned it.
Right.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And it's so, as you said, it's an important piece of retirement planning. You cover, broadly retirement planning. So, I mean, you talk about Social Security, Medicare, long-term care planning. We'll get into a little bit of that later on about, how this fits into the overall picture. So let's look at the system today. Now, people are, concerned about it. As I mentioned in my intro, I think sometimes it's difficult to see exactly what's happening. But from your perspective, what is it that you know about what's happening to the potential benefits and what people can do about it?
Well, Social Security is facing a financial challenge in that the trust fund that you think of the Social Security trust fund as sort of the checking account for the program. Payroll taxes go into it and benefits are paid out of it. And since the 90s, we've been building up very large surpluses in that checking account as a result of the reforms that were passed in 1983. And that was done in part in anticipation of the retirement age wave that would be coming as the large baby boomer generation hit retirement. And we've now reached a point where the trust fund is being drawn down as the boomer age wave accelerates, and also due to a couple other factors. Income inequality actually is one reason for the shrinking of the trust fund, because a greater share of the wage base in the United States is above the cap on payroll taxes that are collected. So escapes the payroll tax, if you will. And then another factor is declining fertility rates in the United States, which means lower birth rates translates into fewer workers, a ratio of workers paying versus people taking out. So for a variety of reasons, that trust fund is headed down and is projected to be exhausted or depleted. Currently, the projection is 2033. So a lot of people mistakenly think that sounds like, oh, that means there won't be a benefit when we reach that point. But what it means is that there would only be sufficient revenue coming in from current taxes to pay about 77% of benefits. So that would be quite a cut. It's an across-the-board cut to all current and future workers, retirees, excuse me. So that would be a catastrophic outcome, particularly for people who are heavily reliant on Social Security benefits. So something needs to be done about that. And that's been debated it's not a new development. We've known it's coming for quite a while. And something is going to have to be done to address it.
Yeah, we can talk about some of those solutions in a bit, and unfortunately, a lot of people project that Congress is not going to do anything until 2032. It's one of those things where they just, press till the very end. But shorter term, I think people are worried about their benefits. I guess there's been a lot of talk about longer wait lines, people not getting callbacks and so forth. What do you hear about what is the short-term impact of just some of the staffing cuts? They've been talking about, office closures. Not clear that that's really happening, but there may be some short-term things in what people can do to make sure that they're on top of what their benefits.
Well, if you're already receiving Social Security, there is not a reason to be concerned that that'll be interrupted, I don't think. The issue here is that there's been a customer service problem at Social Security for many years. It's not a brand new development. Congress has starved the Social Security Administration of the budget that it needs to operate.
Hmm.
It's on an inflation adjusted basis. Budget's down 25% of the time when, the workload has been rising. So that was already creating problems in terms of their ability to keep up in terms of the workforce. And then with the advent of the Trump administration and this Elon Musk-driven Doge initiative, there have been additional slashing of the staff,
Hmm.
and it's really they've lost a lot of talent, whole layers of management. They've been reshuffling the deck in terms of reassigning of employees. IT staff have left in droves, so there are lots of reasons to be worried about what's going on. There have been all kinds of kind of false starts on new procedures that would force people to go through in terms of providing identification and proof of who they are to file for benefits. For a couple of months there, it was extremely difficult to even, stay on top of what was going on there. And there's still good reason to be very worried about the agency's ability to meet the needs of the public.
Yeah, there are things that people can do to. I think one of the things that in our previous conversation you mentioned is that as we made these shifts, I mean, some of the things we're not sure how they'll play out. I mean, I guess they're trying to overhaul some of the old software, but fairly quickly. Whether they can actually institute these changes in a way that doesn't disrupt things is not clear, but that's one issue. But then you've talked to me before about the importance of online connection to Social Security.
Well, everybody should set up their online account at the SSA.gov website. That's probably the fastest and easiest way to transact business at the Social Security Administration. So I would definitely recommend that. Beyond that, it's worth knowing that you need appointments at field offices these days. Booking in is probably not a strategy. And if you need to transact business with them on the phone, you should expect long wait times. And I would say with applications for new benefits, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, since Social Security processes Medicare applications, I would get those applications started, at least several months ahead of the date that you need the benefit to start.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned that one of the backlogs, serious backlogs, is in disability benefits. Is that right?
It is, yes. Anywhere from 4 to 8 months waiting time on initial applications. And that's been a long-running problem as well. It's getting worse.
Yeah. So, Mark, we have a lot more to talk about, but we're going to take a quick break. But, folks, we'll be coming right back. We'll be talking much more with Mark Miller, so don't go anywhere.
Are you caring for an aging loved one? It can feel overwhelming, but you don't have to do it alone. Ron's book, The Caregiving Navigator, is a step-by-step guide designed to help you plan, prepare, and provide compassionate care with confidence. From organizing family conversations to navigating long-term care and finding support for yourself, The Caregiver, it's all here. Find The Caregiving Navigator now on Amazon and take the first step toward peace of mind.
All right, welcome back, folks, to 45 Forward. We're talking today about Social Security and Medicare with Mark Miller, a nationally recognized expert in aging. His latest book is Retirement Reboot, Common Sense Strategies for Getting Back on Track. So before the break, we were talking about some of the issues of disruption and importance of keeping track of your account online. So let's talk about some of the longer term issues that people do worry about. I know that you, in your, discussion with people and in general coverage, a lot of young people are worried that the misnomer is it's going broke, and it's not going broke. But let's talk a little bit more. You mentioned the trust fund, and let's talk a little bit more about basically, so the benefits will just basically be diminished if we don't do something to fix it. So what are some of the things that are being discussed about solving the problem?
I mean, there's a couple ways to right the ship here. You can either cut benefits, you can increase revenue, you can do some combination of the two. And it's worth noting that, Social Security is a self-financed program. It's entirely reliant on revenue from the payroll tax. And so, one of the myths out there about Social Security you hear is that it's somehow a driver of the deficits, the federal debt. Well, that actually doesn't make sense, because if Social Security were able to actually borrow money from the other parts of the government, we wouldn't be facing this potential cliff in 2033. Right. The reason for the cliff is that Social Security cannot by law borrow money. You can either, as I was saying, you can either cut benefits, you can raise the payroll tax rate, you could come up with new sources of taxes for, people have proposed a Wall Street tax or a wealth tax as a way to shore up the system. But as we get closer and closer to that 2033 date, the math really doesn't work for doing it with benefit cuts because it takes too long for those cuts to phase in a way that is meaningful for avoiding the solvency problem. So that, coupled with sort of the state of affairs in Congress with the degree of polarization and dysfunction there, I think a lot of people are thinking that we may get right up to that point and need some kind of a short-term, hopefully short-term, kind of emergency solution, which might be in the form of an injection of general revenue into the program. Nobody I talked to thinks that we're going to reach 2033 and in fact have a 23% cut in benefits. It seems hard to imagine that any member of Congress is going to allow that to happen and have, contemplate going back to face the voters.
Right.
So, there is the possibility of an injection of general revenue into the program while a longer term solution is worked on. But what's interesting there is it would mean that Social Security would in effect be borrowing to make benefit payments at that point because we're in a deficit spending mode already as a country. That's, those are the possible scenarios, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people talk about, raising the retirement age, but as you pointed out in your articles, that's already been done one, and that really is a benefit cut because you're basically shortening, the retirement benefits of people going forward.
Well, and you're basically raising the bar on the age at which you qualify for 100% of your benefit. So, and as I say, it's kind of too late to do that in a way that would meaningfully impact the solvency problem. And on top of all that, I think raising the retirement age is not an equitable solution in the sense that, while the U.S. has experienced gains in longevity, the gains are not evenly distributed. The gains in longevity have really gone mainly to higher income, better educated people. And so, when you talk about raising the retirement age for people who are not living quite as long, that's an inequitable approach, I believe.
Yeah, and there are certain jobs in which that's not really practical. I mean, not, white collar jobs.
Right.
Difficult manual labor jobs is not really fair to that.
Right. It's an interesting thing is that public survey polling has repeatedly shown that the public prefers new revenue as opposed to benefit cuts. And that's across the board. It crosses all political and demographic lines, which is pretty rare these days. So it kind of comes down to, whether Congress is going to do what the public wants it to do or not.
Yeah, it seems to me that is an effective. I mean, it's like, okay, raising the cap of, collecting revenue. It's like, okay, among that higher demographic, it's like, are they going to miss it as much as the lower sector? I mean, it seems to me that if you're going to make a fix in the system, that's, an appropriate way to do it. Of course, it's politically difficult when you have high income political donors. But now, do you see also, I mean, younger people getting involved? It seems to me that I've been noticing that, they're like getting engaged. They realize what the implications may be for themselves and for their parents.
Well, more generally, I think that's the case in politics. I think on this issue, what I notice is a lot of skepticism among younger people that Social Security is going to be there for them. I think there's been so much negative spin and hype on this that, and just mistrust of government in general, that, I think the degree of worry and skepticism among younger people is quite high. I wrote about that for the New York Times last year, and it was interesting to see just how pervasive it is.
Yeah, I think that, a few months ago, I was involved with just talking about Social Security on a local college campus with AARP. And I think that, some college students stopped by and they were talking about it. And it's like, well, if there are diminished returns on Social Security for your parents, guess who's going to pick up the slack? You.
Well, the benefit cuts that were enacted in 1983 already fall on today's young people because it gradually phased in a higher retirement age from age 65 up to age 67 for everybody born after 1960. And that implies on average about a 19% cut in benefits. So that's already in place. And, I think it's an argument against making further changes in the retirement age.
Yeah. And now I also have seen, perhaps you wrote about this as well, that there has been a surge in people also closer to retirement age, applying early. Just, that anxiety about, start, applying at 62.
Yeah, there has been a bit of an uptick in people applying early as a result of all the negative news about the Social Security Administration this year, which is unfortunate. I don't think it's fair to say it's been a massive upturn. It's been something that's been, been noticeable. One thing that's going on in Social Security Administration right now is that there's been basically shutting off the valve of public release of data of all kinds about the program by the SSA. So there's a lot less transparency over the last couple of months about what's actually going on there, which is very concerning.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you can do about that. No, I suppose you could raise your voice about it. Right?
Well, the SSA says that they're revamping all their reporting systems. But, I think it remains to be seen whether that's the case or whether they're just trying to kind of draw the shade down on what they're up to there.
Again, it's sort of hard to tell what's going on, but, and there's been talk about, access to Social Security data. Have you heard much about what the potential impact would be of that?
Well, it means that, analysts who are trying to track what's going on there are having more trouble in discerning what's happening there.
Okay. Well, I think one of my conversations with you, actually listening to one of your previous webinars, I think one of the things you talked about is that, people should just speak up. You said, what can you do? Let your lawmakers know what you want.
Right. I think, there's a problem with people sort of passively watching and treating this as a spectator game where, it's very important to let people know, let legislators know what you want.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So we're going to take another quick break, folks. We'll be right back talking much more with Mark Miller, a Social Security expert, a nationally recognized expert on aging and retirement issues. And his latest terrific book is called Retirement Reboot, Common Sense Strategies for Getting Back on Track. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Do you like what you're hearing? Well, we've got plenty more where that came from. Head over to 45forward.org, where you'll find a full archive of over 200 episodes of the 45 Forward podcast, all hosted by Ron. Each week, Ron talks with fascinating guests, experts, advocates, and everyday folks, sharing insights and stories to help you live a better, fuller life in your second half. We cover everything from health and caregiving to careers, relationships, and finding purpose, whatever helps you move forward with clarity and confidence. That's 45forward.org. Check it out and keep moving forward.
Welcome back, folks. Once again, we're talking today with aging and retirement expert Mark Miller about Social Security. And now we're going to shift a little bit to Medicare and Medicaid, specifically about the Reconciliation Act that's involved in Congress now and what the implications might be for various social insurance and programs for older folks. So let's talk about that because we're happening right now. A lot of discussion about it. So what are your thoughts?
Right. The bill is being debated in Congress as we were taping this. One interesting thing in this bill is that it could actually hasten that Social Security trust fund insolvency date by a year or two.
Wow.
Mainly by reducing the amount of revenue collected from the income tax on Social Security benefits, which is deposited to the trust fund. And it would do that by the Senate version of the bill increases the standard deduction dramatically, which in turn would reduce the number of seniors paying taxes on benefits. So good news here for anybody who's paying tax on the benefits is you're going to get some tax relief. But some analysis suggests that it could bring that date even closer, which is certainly concerning. On the Medicaid side of things, the big impact here would be on low-income seniors, people who are eligible for both Medicaid and Medicare. So this is the so-called dual eligible population, which is about 1/5 of all Medicare beneficiaries, and they account for a disproportionate share of Medicaid spending. This is the older part of the Medicaid population that tends to have greater healthcare needs. So that's, this is the group that is likely to see some impacts. States are facing significant budget reductions out of this bill, and there's concern that they'll respond by cutting out various optional benefits, cutting payments to healthcare providers, limiting service availability. So this could kind of create a domino effect that undermines health access for the most vulnerable people on Medicare. And these work requirements that are in the bill would have a devastating impact on disabled and elderly people. And a lot of studies have shown that the work requirements don't really boost employment levels anyway. But so there's a lot of kind of disastrous implications, I think, for older adults, particularly low-income adults in the Medicaid side. When you look at Medicare, there's sort of a grab bag of provisions in Medicare. I wouldn't say that the Medicare provisions in the bill are the big headline here, but nonetheless, there are some things. One, again, talking about lower income seniors, an impact on the Medicare Savings Program. This is a program that runs state by state and helps lower income people pay their Part B premiums. And there was a rule put in place during the last year of the Biden administration that was going to simplify and make it easier for people to enroll in those programs. And that rule is being pushed back roughly 10 years. So basically put on ice. There are restrictions, new restrictions on eligibility for Medicare, restricting it to only people who are U.S. citizens and green card holders. So this is part of the whole immigration crackdown. So eliminating eligibility for people with temporary protected status, asylum seekers, and refugees. The bill has adjustments to payment rates to physicians. Another provision I think is interesting is it delays implementation of a new rule that places minimum staffing requirements on nursing homes. So it's an effort to try to boost staffing levels in nursing homes, and that's been delayed. And then the last thing I can mention about Medicare, kind of interesting, for people who use health savings accounts while they're working, there's a need to stop contributing to those when you enroll in Medicare Part A. And this legislation proposed changing that so that people who are enrolled in Part A could continue contributing to health savings accounts. So it kind of would eliminate what's been kind of a complicated wrinkle in HSAs for people.
Okay.
So that's kind of a quick wheel through everything in this bill on those three topics.
Yeah. Now I know before all this, legislation moved forward, it seemed like there were some advances in Medicare coverage, right? I mean, that are there some positive things to look forward to in terms of Medicare coverage?
Well, the big thing that was implemented this year was the new $2,000 cap on total out-of-pocket spending in Part D.
Right.
The prescription drug program. So that's in place. This legislation doesn't touch that.
Okay.
One thing that I'm kind of keeping an eye on, however, is that one of the things that the Biden administration did for this first year of the new cap was put in place essentially a mechanism to incent insurance companies to limit the size of premium increases.
Okay.
So, there was, the concern here is that because of the strengthening of the insurance with that $2,000 cap, that insurers would increase premiums quite a bit. So this program that was put in place basically capped premium increases to no more than $35.
Right.
So a lot of listeners may have noticed increases in their premiums of $35 this year. And there's the reason for that. There's a question as to whether that subsidy will continue next year. We don't know yet. If it does, then you can expect some stability in premiums. If it's not continued, it could create some havoc in the Part D market for enrollment for 2026. I always encourage people to keep an eye on their plans when the new data is released in the fall. Everybody gets a notice, usually in September.
Right.
About what the coming year will look like. And you really need to pay attention to that. A lot of people don't bother to recheck their coverage from year to year in Part D and also in Medicare Advantage. And it's really important to do that because these plans can change from year to year. Drug coverage can change, premiums can change, out-of-pocket limits can change. So very important to do that. And to, if a plan is no longer a good fit for you, you should definitely reshop it during the fall enrollment period.
I know you've written about Medicare, traditional Medicare, Medicare Advantage. Do you see any trends in that respect?
Well, Medicare Advantage is now over half of all Medicare enrollment.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so that's really remarkable. And, well-documented issues in Medicare Advantage with, Medicare Advantage basically is managed care. And so you have all the things that are attendant to managed care, the red tape hassles associated with either denials of care, prior authorizations, the networks of healthcare providers, is a provider in network, out of network. There are some discussions about trying to reform that program. And, I think the progress on that's been quite limited so far. There's also an issue with overpayments in these programs that's been well documented. I think there's a growing interest in perhaps reining in those overpayments, but the politics around that are extremely difficult.
Yeah. So, I mean, this whole movement of, waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, it seems to me that a lot is made of that. But talk a bit about, what the facts are about. Okay.
That's simple.
That's simple. Okay. Okay. So not within the agency. I mean, yeah, it seems like.
Is there fraud in Medicare? Yes. It's, I think it's been documented that it's relatively small as a percentage of total activity in the program, but the numbers seem large because it's such a massive program.
Right.
And of course, it should be combated and eliminated if at all possible. But a lot of what's going on in social insurance these days goes on under the cover of we're not trying to really cut benefits for anybody that deserves them, quote unquote. We're just trying to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. And over and over again, it's been demonstrated that the total amounts of that going on are relatively small.
Yeah. And it's not within the agencies themselves. It's on the outside. It's people scamming the system.
People defrauding the system, exactly.
Right.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. And I think that, so, I mean, it's a little counterintuitive that we're, cracking down on these inspectors general and these agencies.
Right. Firing them all.
Yeah. So let's see. So let's shift a little bit to some of your broader perspectives on, how this fits into retirement and long-term, care planning. Because I think that that's something you've written about, and people don't think enough about it. So let's talk about how this fits into, long-term care in a broad sense as it fits into retirement planning.
Well, I think a lot of people think that Medicare will cover long-term care needs, and it really doesn't. It covers a very short period of skilled nursing care following a hospitalization, but it doesn't cover sort of the more routine help with daily living needs that people might have. The problem with long-term care is it's a hard risk to really think about. I think it's hard for people to really conceive that they may need something like this, and really to assess the risk is not easy. And we don't have very good mechanisms for planning for it. I mean, the private long-term care insurance market is largely dysfunctional. It's shrunk quite a bit. It was never very popular to start with. And we don't really have a social insurance mechanism to deal with it. So all that's going on. And at the same time, costs of care are really jumping at alarming rates. The studies that are done show that the price of most long-term care services has been jumping double and triple the rate of inflation in recent years. And this getting exacerbated by kind of this almost perfect storm of colliding of supply and demand. The country's getting older, the number of people who need the services is rising, and we are facing constraints on the supply side, both because we don't pay enough to long-term care workers. The jobs are not regarded as good jobs. They don't pay enough. And then the immigration crackdown that's going on is going to constrict the availability of labor in that market as well, in certain parts of the country as well. So I think there's good reason to be very concerned about the future of long-term care. Now, the other piece of long-term care is that more affluent people can afford to self-fund it. If you can save enough to know that you're going to have money to pay for it. Or if you have high Social Security benefits that can also help meet a long-term care need. And I often make the point that delaying a Social Security claim as long as possible is one good way to help insure against that risk. Because you're generating a higher monthly benefit that again inflation adjusted every year. So, those are a couple ways to think about it. But I think it's an area of some legitimate concern or worry. I've long felt that a smart approach to this would be kind of a hybrid public and private approach. Have a social insurance component that everybody participates in to provide sort of a base level of services and care. And then if people want to add on to that with supplemental policies, I think that could work. And I think that even in the commercial insurance space, I think there's increasing recognition that would be a sensible approach. And when I think, a restructuring of the risk profile so that, you knew the government was going to take a piece of it and the commercial side would take a piece of it would certainly be one way of dealing with that. A couple of states have gotten into this and tried to launch solutions at the state level. Washington State being the most prominent example, that they launched a state program there, and they're looking to add this supplemental commercial marketplace component sometime soon. But it's an area of concern. I think it's probably the biggest sort of gaping hole in the system we have for insuring against risk in retirement.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a patchwork system. It really exacerbates, the income gaps between the top and the bottom.
Yeah, and then the other thing worth mentioning here is that Medicaid is the single largest insurer of long-term care. Where over half of all long-term care is paid out of Medicaid. If I said Medicare, I meant to say Medicaid.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Medicaid is the biggest source of insurance for long-term care. And with these cuts that are going on in this budget reconciliation bill, there's really good reason to be worried about the impact that that's going to have on the nursing home sector and on the long-term care sector, both for Medicaid patients, but it also will probably lead to further increases in private payer costs. So that's a great concern at this point as well. The Medicaid situation, people sometimes qualify for Medicaid by spending down. To qualify for Medicaid, you have to have very low levels of income and assets. The rules vary from state to state. But that is one thing that happens, is that people go into long-term care, have exhausting resources, and then they go on to Medicaid.
Right. So we'll talk more about that, because I want to talk more about that in our last segment, and then some of your broader thoughts about how this all works with your retirement planning and rebooting when necessary. So, folks, we have one more segment. I'm looking forward to talking much more in our last segment with Mark Miller, the author of Retirement Reboot, Common Sense Strategies for Getting Back on Track. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Caring for a loved one can feel overwhelming. That's why we created caregivingnav.com, your personal guide through the complex world of caregiving. It's a free interactive website built around the Caregiving Navigator book, with tools designed to make your journey easier. Whether you're planning ahead, managing care right now, or navigating a crisis, you'll find step-by-step advice, trusted resources, and over a dozen downloadable checklists. From legal planning to home safety, from medical decisions to emotional support, it's all here, all in one place. Just visit caregivingnav.com, because you're not alone on this path, and the help you need is just a click away.
Welcome back to 45 Forward. Once again, we're talking with aging and retirement expert Mark Miller. And before the break, we were talking about long-term care issues and planning. So this is a big area that you mentioned, Mark, and I think that there's, as I mentioned earlier, we have a sort of a patchwork system, and I think it really is a problem, because this is something that, at least the statistics show that, 2/3 of people are going to face some sort of long-term care issue, as they get older. Problem is that we're not sure what kinds. And so it seemed to me that what you're suggesting in terms of a hybrid system, so public and private, would make sense, because you need to cover lots of situations and offer lots of different options.
And the problem with that solution is that it requires a tax increase. You'd have to create probably a payroll tax levy to support it. And so that's really tough to do politically, with one political party that absolutely refuses to raise taxes of any kind. You mentioned it's an issue that affects 2/3 of people, and that's sort of reflects the general landscape of retirement security. Roughly 2/3 of households getting close to retirement, probably not financially ready for it for a whole variety of reasons, which is really the theme of the book that I wrote a couple years ago. So, as part of a bigger picture of inadequate retirement preparation that I think reflects a number of things. I think it reflects the stagnation. It really reflects what's been going on in the U.S. economy over the last few decades more than anything else. I don't say lack of preparedness as a way to point the finger, quite the opposite. I think it's reflective of stagnation in wage growth. I did some number crunching for the book, and the person approaching retirement now has lived and worked through several major economic downturns during the course of their career that often puts people out of work for years at a time. You may even get back to work, you don't necessarily recover the losses from that. And we think about the Great Recession that occurred, not only did people lose jobs, sometimes people lost their homes. So there's a lot of long-term economic damage that explains, I think, a lot of what people are dealing with as they get close to retirement. So the book was an attempt to try to explore what are sort of late in the game strategies and things people can do.
So talking about the rebooting, I mean, are there things, as the economy and our lifestyles have changed, that we need to kind of shift in our retirement planning thinking?
Well, I go through a list of really a menu of options that people can think about, everything from, working longer. And, when I say working longer, you hear people sometimes say, well, I'll never retire. I'll never be able to retire. I'll have to work forever. And that's, not what I necessarily mean when I say that. Even working a few years longer can be a really important lever for improving retirement outcomes, because it can enable a later Social Security filing and the higher monthly or annual benefits that come with that. It can be an opportunity to save for retirement in later life. And it can be more years. Well, it means fewer net years living off of retirement savings and more living off of wages, as well as more years one hopes on employer subsidized health insurance. For any number of reasons, working longer can be a really important lever. Late Social Security filing, for many people, makes a lot of sense. And again, when I say that, sometimes what people hear is, oh, I should wait till 70. And that's great, if you can do that. But even waiting a little bit past, a couple of years past full retirement age, or not filing early, is beneficial in most cases. There is not a one size fits all solution here. I don't mean to suggest that. I think is a highly personal decision that depends a lot on your personal circumstances. There can be good reasons to claim early. For example, if you're out of work and just, need the money very badly, or you're not in good health, don't have expectation of great longevity, particularly for married couples or people with good reason to think they have a chance to live long, delaying your claim can be a very good strategy. As one economist once said to me about this, it's better to plan to live, not to die.
Right.
So, these are some of the things that I explore in the book. Careful examination of your spending. I think a lot of times the focus is on income and savings, not enough on, scrubbing the budget, or the things you might want to consider doing to bring your expenses in line. Is downsizing part of the picture, tapping home equity in some cases. It's kind of a holistic look at ways to get back on track. Saving, even with I have a chapter on saving for retirement, and looking at the impact of even getting a late start can be meaningful.
Yeah. So where can people get the book?
Well, it's available in all the usual spots. And if you visit my website, you can learn more about it. The retirementrevised.com is my website, and there's information about the book there.
Right. And other things people should know about? I mean, you've got a newsletter.
Yes, I do this.
You've got a
I do the newsletter these days. I'm writing for the New York Times and occasionally for Morningstar. I've sort of reached a point in my own life where I'm scaling back a little bit on all that. Wouldn't say retired, but taking my foot off the gas pedal just a little bit. But you still find my work in the New York Times. And if you want to follow what I'm doing, easiest way, if you go to that website I just mentioned, is you can sign up for, I do a free newsletter there that comes out probably 2 to 3 times a month.
Right.
I include there links to my latest articles, as well as links to work by other journalists that I found interesting, links to studies, links to online webinars and things that I've run across that I think are worth passing along.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, good. And if people want to contact you, just go to the website and, retirementrevised.com and send you an email. Okay. Yeah. I know you mentioned that people do get you get a lot of interest in Social Security. Have you noticed any sort of broad trends in terms of what kinds of questions you get from readers? Anything?
Well, I think right now the big thing is worry about Social Security.
Okay.
Which we talked about earlier in the program.
Right.
I think that's far and away what we're seeing the most of, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
Social Security is really a crown jewel of American public policy. And I think it's a shame that it's being, it's receiving the treatment it's receiving right now.
Yeah.
We need to do better.
Other than, are there places people can basically advocate? I mean, other than going to their legislators and saying this is important to us. And I mean, I do know that, a lot of legislators, they do track the phone calls and letters and emails and so forth.
I think that's very important. I think showing up in public. I have a section in the last chapter of my book arguing for sort of revival of social insurance in the United States. In addition to advocating, I think educate yourself. So it's important for people to understand kind of the myths and realities and not fall for the political spin about Social Security. The language around Social Security that you hear in the political arena can be quite kind of tricky, actually. When a politician says we need to protect Social Security, you need more detail on what they mean by that. If they say we
Mhm.
need to protect it for future generations, you need to know what they mean by that. Do they mean
Right.
protecting it by cutting benefits? Or do they mean something else? Do they mean, raising revenue? So, it's important to educate yourself about the language of Social Security and be able to, push beyond that. Another, I think, trick in the book here is when you hear politicians talking about, let's create a commission and have a closed door commission to arrive at solutions. Well, that's just a way for them to get behind a closed door and come up with something that they're not putting their fingerprints on.
Mhm.
I think we need accountability. We need the future of Social Security debated out in the open. I think that's terribly important.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things I think people should be aware of.
Good, good. Yeah, I think that certainly from my journalistic background, when you get questions about, protecting Social Security, my always response was, could you be more specific?
Yeah,
That was-
definitely.
Yeah, that was always a good. Or could you give me an example of what you're talking about? I think that really presses the issue and forces that specificity really, or clarification. Could you clarify with that? I think that's important. Yeah, all right. Tell me more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, this has been very enlightening, and I appreciate it. Always thought-provoking, informative, and I'm going to have you back probably in the fall as we get into that Medicare season. So I just want to thank you again. Once again, let people know retirementadvised.com. And you're also, I think you're on social media as well, on Facebook. We can probably kind of, follow you there as well.
Yep.
Once again, yeah, absolutely. So once again, folks, Ron Roel, 45 Forward. Thanks for spending this hour with me and Mark Miller. Any suggestions or comments, you can email me at ronroel@gmail.com. And be sure to join me next time when I'll be talking with Raman Lombardo and Andrea Padinas for an inside look at how a dynamic senior center works today. So until then, folks, keep moving forward, 45 Forward.